recording in progress. There you go. And so that for those who aren't able to attend, we'll have the session recorded and we'll put it on our website. So we are so delighted to have three knowledgeable guests here today. Nate Horwitz-Willis, who's the Assistant Professor of Public Health and Coordinator of Public Health Practice at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. Al Averill, a retired soil scientist from the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, and Carlos Gonzalez, Operations Manager at Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery in Florida. And we're just so happy that they could all join us today. Before I tell you a little bit more about them and we get into the presentations, I just wanted to spend a minute providing some context for this discussion. So Green Burial Massachusetts and our partner Kestrel Land Trust have been scouring the Connecticut River Valley for an appropriate parcel for a conservation cemetery. And as most of you know, you've kind of been here in our journey with us throughout the last couple of years. And while we've been looking for specific criteria, road access, beauty, wildlife habitat, we have to have the right soils for human burial. And this aspect alone is really critical. And as we'll discuss today, these soils are not really easy to come by in the valley. In fact, the proverbial needle in the haystack really best describes our search for land. But over the past year, our team has created a system for identifying and evaluating soils. Al Averill will provide information on the soil composition and soils in the Connecticut River Valley. Carlos Gonzalez, coming from a very different soil makeup in Florida, will speak about the importance of understanding soils as the operations manager of a conservation cemetery there, and the power of bringing a community together to hand dig graves. And Nate Horwitz-Willis, our first speaker, will provide insight on soils from a public health perspective and speak to the myths that many people still have about natural burial. So I just wanted to provide that context. And again, we will go through, our presenters will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then feel free to put your questions in the chat, and then we'll have a conversation at the end of the presentations. So Nate Horwitz-Willis is a doctor of public health. He's currently, as I mentioned earlier, the Assistant Professor and Coordinator of Public Health Practice at the Mass College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. And he also serves as a Public Health Officer for the United States Air Force National Guard in Massachusetts. He's the founding principal for LALY-WAP. His public health expertise focuses on equitable policy and health improvement for the development of vibrant, economic, and healthy communities internationally. And he previously served as the town of Plymouth, Massachusetts, Director of Public Health, while advocating and educating about public health merits of green burial. So we're really happy to have Nate with us today. And I'm going to ask Nate to share his screen and great.
So you ready for me?
Yeah, we are ready.
All right, awesome. Thank you. I'm so happy and thrilled to be here. And as Judith has said, I previously served as the Director of Public Health for the town of Plymouth. So had opportunity to present some aspects of this current presentation when I was the director. However, I am happy to also note that some things have changed for the good of green burials. But we'll get into that. So generally speaking, where I want to go in this short amount of time, I want to talk about the brief history. Then I'll walk you through some of the current aspects of the natural burial, the current, people think what is natural burials with our current makeup of our cemetery system. And just talking about the path forward a little bit for green burials from a public health perspective. So in terms of where we are with our burial system, the authority generally rests with a local board of health. And the public health department at the local level acts as a burial agent to say, hey, we're going to issue this burial permit and we're going to review death certificates. So that's where that rests with. Now, in terms of the process for our current burial system, we're all familiar with embalming, right? So when it comes to embalming, the brief history on that is that it was a popular thing because transporting bodies during the Civil War required that, hey, we need to preserve the dead. So that made that method very, very popular. And then in terms of the regulation of it, there really isn't a regulation at the state level. Nothing really is explicit. And then the worries around, getting any kind of contagion from a dead body was that, hey, using embalming methods would help to preserve a body and would be serving up as a precautionary method. Really not a lot of evidence at all to indicate that you can use embalming fluid to ward off any infectious disease, and even not much evidence to help out with our soil conditions either. And we'll get into those details a little bit more. So that's the function of the public health department and the function of the use of embalming. Those are two big issues because a lot of the public or even some boards of health and public health departments don't fully understand their roles in this. So there's a big misconception on that. And then also that board of health body is the approving authority that says, hey, we want to put a cemetery on site in a municipal location. And they also work with the town meeting to act as the municipal authority that approves it too. So a lot isn't really detailed in that. A lot of people don't know those details about that in their own cities or towns. And then Mass DEP and then also Mass Department of Public Health, they act as an authority too when it comes to looking at, hey, what are we going to do with our cremation and burial sites, right? So when it comes to the embalming piece, though, I want to get into a little bit more specifics because it's important in the process once we understand the cemetery site. So detailed below, you look at the makeup of what's happening with the use of embalming fluids, right? The key point here, well, two key points here I want to point out is that generally we don't leave bodies out more than 14 days. So the risk of getting any kind of contagion is very low. So the need to use embalming fluid has been raised up as like, hey, why are we doing this if we don't have to, since we're not transporting these bodies for longer than 14 days like we used to on train tracks during the Civil War. Now, the other thing, if you look to the very far right of the screen, depending on how your screen is oriented, we know that the use of embalming fluid is a known carcinogen. And that's a big issue. There's been a lot of debate as to, well, what does that go in the soil? And if we don't use embalming fluid, what is that going to do in terms of, pathogens or any other, bacteria or microorganisms that may be harmful? What do we do here? Now, as Judith has said, there's a lot that goes into picking a site, and that relies upon the soils. So if you're doing the picking of the cemetery the right way anyways, you're taking that into consideration, and that's where we use our top-notch soil scientists to help us out in that. And also some of our public health authorities and officials who understand the transport and the transmission of disease contaminants and chemical contaminants. So when we're talking about that embalming, the 80s and the 90s, a lot of attention was given to that about our occupations. Now, the media did bring a lot of attention in the 90s to embalming fluid and what that was doing to people who were handling bodies, morticians, or even funeral home workers, right? So a lot of attention was being given to some of these health outcomes associated with cancer. So here are a few articles. In 2009, it was brought to light by Reuters because of formaldehyde as cancer risk. And excuse me, I don't have a lot of time to get into the articles because there's so much information to cover. So if I'm going fast, if you have a question, please ask me to go back to my slides so that way we can review some of this. So excuse me if I have to speed through it. So this article looked at 400 funeral workers, and that was kind of like a big, a big media whirlwind right there. And then again in 2011, the New York Times brought it back up and was like, well, hey, we're using it, but embalmers still embrace it. One of the key reasons why is that in industry, it was promoted as being still safe and effective, and it was, seen as a protective agent. But not a lot of attention was given to, well, what does this do in terms of the transport and the fate in our soils and even in our groundwater? No one really gave that a lot of attention. Mm-hmm. So now when we talk about that attention given, we have to go back to the research. A lot of the research that was done, really back in the 80s. Getting access to a lot of the research literature was hard back in the 80s. Now we're in 2021, and depending on your, affiliations, you can get access to research pretty quickly and easily. So what I was able to do, I went back in and I looked at my research records, and then some of this research came back up to light in the 80s. And what we started to see is that, hey, in the 80s, this was a big deal. So people in the scientific community knew that if you were a mortician and if you were old in your 50s and up, you were likely to pass and die from cancers, right? And I highlighted here the percentage of, the population, if you would see broken down by age across the different years, you would see who would die the most. And then in the 70s, you would see that a lot of the older men would pass away easily because they had been working in the profession of being a mortician for decades. And they would pass away, if you look here, I highlighted, they would pass away from cancers and also other circulatory issues associated with the inhalation and dermal exposure to embalming fluid. So now then, if we keep looking in the research record in 84, we start to see the same thing here. Some of the things I highlighted were different types of causes of death associated with being exposed to formaldehyde. Now then, again, starts to come up in 2009. We had a big gap between the 80s, maybe early 90s, and then in the early 2000 period of what types of cancer we were seeing. So more attention was brought back to it in the research record and was found to be very significant that, again, people using formaldehyde, handling it, would have brain cancer.
Hey, we have about 3 minutes or so.
All right, I'm just going to flash through the records here really quickly. And then it's brought up here again in 2018. So now, in terms of being in Massachusetts, I mentioned earlier who was the approval authority at the state levels and also at the local levels. And then in 2018, the big key point here is that there's no really official recognition of green burials in the state of Massachusetts and its public health merits. And that's where we were in 2018. But now, again, when we look at burials and then the research record, we start to see some concerning things. In 2000, we saw that there was a lot of issues around chemicals and heavy metals and what was going on in our soils. And this was done in Ohio. Now, this was one of the first studies done in the United States that showed this. Now then, we fast forward a little bit more in 2003. We started to see that there is contamination associated with bacteria and also chemicals. This was done in Portugal. And then also another study looked at a review of a lot of the evidence. And it was essentially saying that, well, the way that we're going about our burials currently, there's a concern with viruses and other contamination within our soils. But people think that because you're in a casket, it doesn't matter. And it's showing that it actually does matter because some of these caskets are starting to open up. Some of them are starting to leach. Another study was done in 2012 to show the same thing. Then if we fast forward a little bit more, in 2018, much more recently, when this was not available, we saw that pollution from formaldehyde also became a big concern. So it does show up. And some of the highlights here that are coming up is that some of this formaldehyde will percolate into the soil for about 14 weeks. The World Health Organization says that, hey, you can have a low amount, but still we were finding in the research that we were exceeding those low amounts of formaldehyde. So it is a significant public health issue that we're not giving enough credence to. As you see, more of this research is coming up. Now, one of the things about it is that even in our most recent study here in 2021, we're seeing that even in urban cemeteries, it's starting to pop up as well worldwide, not just in select countries, but we just don't have enough research. We need more, and our current state of affairs associated with green burials is pointing to more recognition. And this was actually posted up here. I found this in this year. It wasn't posted up in the previous years from 2018 to 2020. So this was posted up by the state acknowledging green burials. So we're currently at an impasse in terms of where research is, and we do need more. I know I am out of time, and I'm looking forward to answering more questions if there's going to be more that are asked. And I can say that I have reviewed some of the practices of green burials, and they do adhere to strict and stringent rules and guidelines. And so we just need the science to back us up more on that. And that is all the time that I have with so much information. I'm sorry that I can't go into too many details here, but I look forward to your questions.
Wow. Okay, Nate, thank you for that great overview. And yes, please, I'm sure that there are many questions, so please put those in the chat and we'll come back to Nate. You can never talk enough about embalming, that's for sure. So let's move on and get down into the soils with Al Averill. I want to just tell you a little bit about Al. He's studied soils and geology at the University of Rhode Island. He started his career with the USDA Soil Conservation Service, the Natural Resources Conservation Service in the Catskill Mountains in New York, and 21 years as a field soil scientist mapping and classifying soils as part of the National Cooperative Soil Survey. He's mapped about 400,000 acres in New York and Massachusetts. And as a soil survey project leader, he completed soil surveys of Middlesex and Franklin counties in Massachusetts. And you can imagine, yes, he's dug a lot of holes. It was 6 years at the Soil Data Quality Specialist, providing technical expertise and quality assurance for the soil survey program in the glaciated Northeast, which is some of our issue. Soil maps, information about soils, and interpretations for various land uses are the result of all of his efforts, and all of this is available on the Web Soil Survey. His last position before retiring from the NRCS was as a state soil scientist for Massachusetts and Vermont. He helped people understand soils and soil information to encourage wise land use, which is, one of the reasons that we wanted to get him involved in our project. And in his part-time semi-retired life, he's working under an NRCS American Farmland Trust partnership to help municipalities recognize and designate farmland of local importance to expand eligibility for farmland preservation programs. Most importantly, he's a husband to one, a father to three, and a brother to five. And what more is there? So Al, thank you for joining us, and please feel free to share your screen and talk to us about soils.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction. What I learned from that introduction is that all the agencies I've worked for and that I've been associated with have names that are too long. Let's see here. Let me know if you can see my first slide, which is a soil profile.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, I just have 6 slides. So hopefully I can do this in 10 minutes and meet the objectives. One of the things I was asked to do is just define what soil is, and folks probably have a pretty good idea of that, but from a technical perspective, it's the unconsolidated mineral and organic material on the surface of the earth that has either undergone some sort of formation change or weathering process, or is capable of supporting plant growth. Now, there's lots of different definitions. Depending on what your purpose is, engineers might have a different definition, but as far as the USDA is concerned, it's really tied into this natural entity that forms on the surface of the earth and supports plant growth. But we're more interested in its functionality for green burial. And so what are its functions for green burial? Well, obviously it's a container, right? We're putting a body in the ground and it's being contained by the soil. What happens and what is it that we're looking to have happen within the soil itself? If the conditions are right, we are providing in an environment that's conducive to decomposition. And the big deal there is microbes, the microbes that decompose organic material. So we're looking for an environment that is going to be conducive to that and encourage that ecosystem. We're looking for the treatment of pathogens and leachate within the soil. And sort of as a fringe benefit, by putting a body in the ground, there's nutrient availability for microbes as well as macro fauna and flora, and plant nutrient uptake, of course. So again, if the conditions are suitable, what happens is an ecosystem is in existence that provides a nourishing environment for microbes, the decomposers, and also through the sponge-like property of the soil, absorbs liquids and holds on to moisture, and through chemical and physical processes, holds on to compounds for treatment by simply grabbing onto them and having adherence to the surface area of the soil's mineral and organic components. So what's the big deal, right? Why are we having such a hard time here? As Judith mentioned, Massachusetts is in part of the glaciated Northeast, and depending on where you are in southern New England, glaciers covered our part of the world 12 to 14,000 years ago. And when they came and went, they deposited material in a lot of different fashions. And I don't know, can folks see my cursor? I'm pointing to the upper left-hand corner here. You can see material here being deposited at the base of a receding glacier. And a lot of our soils are developed in this type of material. It's called subglacial till. And the typical characteristic of that material is that it's dense and it's impermeable to the downward flow of water and air. And in some cases, root penetration is difficult, as opposed to material that's deposited by glacial meltwater, very different, very coarse textured, sandy, gravelly, or sands and gravels in different layers, highly permeable, water and air moves through them quite readily. So two very major predominant depositions that we find throughout the state of Massachusetts, just as examples, but two very different characteristics. So when you look at different types of modes of deposition, the parent material from which the soil is developed, we have variability. And when you tie that into things like the climate that existed as the soil is formed, the organisms that act on the soil, the amount of time through which the soil developed, and probably more importantly, throughout our part of the world, is the landscape position that the soil lies in. Is it on a hilltop? Is it in a depression where water is going to collect? That the water soil relationship is extremely important as to what the suitability of the soil is for green burial. What are the ideal conditions? We want a soil that's permeable, where water and air can move freely throughout the soil. All living things need water and air, and so that's important to nurture the environment by which microbes are going to exist. Although water and air need to move through the soil readily, the soil has to have the capacity to hold on to some moisture too, and to be able to filter what we're putting into the soil. I mean, some of these things sound like contradictions. You know, I'm saying, well, we have to hold moisture, but the next item is, well, the soil needs to be high and dry. It can't be in a position in the landscape where it's going to have saturation in the spring of the year that's at or near the surface. Decomposition does not happen under saturated conditions, or it's slowed to a great extent under saturated conditions. So although we want good moisture holding capacity, we also want a landscape position where water is going to move down throughout the soil profile. And of course, we don't want a soil that's going to be subject to flooding or ponding. Now, here's a tough one in our part of the world: few or no large rock fragments, right? I mean, everywhere you go throughout the upland positions throughout the state of Massachusetts, we find stone walls and boulders. And if you have large boulders, it makes it tough to excavate. And high content of these coarse fragments reduce the contact with finer materials with the body for decomposition. The soil has to be deep. Right? It has to have suitable depth to a restrictive layer, such as bedrock, or a dense layer. And of course, slope is important. You know, we live in a very hilly part of the world, and once you exceed a certain slope range, becomes difficult to gain access. Erosion becomes an issue. And so slope is important. And the landscape position. Where is water going to run? Is it going to run away from the grave site, or is it going to run into the grave site? So all of these things should be taken into consideration. Bottom line, we need a loamy. Loamy meaning a pretty good proportion of sand, silt, and clay. Very deep soil that is deep to a restrictive layer or to seasonal saturation. And you want a convex shaped slope, where a gentle slope where water is going to flow away, and not a lot of large stones and boulders. Easy to find in Massachusetts, right? This is a map of Massachusetts, obviously. This is a parent material map. This is the stuff from which the soil is developed. And it's a nice map, maybe a little bit tough to read because of the scale. But if you look at the sort of the tannish color here, those are soils that have a dense layer, or they're associated with a dense layer. So they may perch water. This sort of tannish color, you can see a few clusters of this tannish gray color. It's probably the best soil for green burial. The sort of maroon color consists of the same type of parent material. However, it's also associated with soils that are shallow to bedrock. So that's problematic. The sort of light blue color that you see here, these are all glacial lake beds. They tend to have layers of very fine clay or very fine sand alternating and silt, and they tend to be impermeable to the downward flow of water. You see down the southeastern part of the state, which Nate can probably relate to sandy soils down in that part of the world. This is where the predominant material deposited by glacial meltwater occurred. Highly permeable soils, maybe not the best filters. The Connecticut River Valley, you see sort of this lavender color. Those are soils that formed in recurrent flooding events, sediment deposited from flooding, right? All the great civilizations of the world located where you find this type of deposit, right? Deltas, floodplains, great agricultural soils. The ones that are on the higher terraces that are no longer subject to flooding are probably those that are the most suited for green burial. However, they're also the best suited for agriculture. So you have those issues to deal with. So you look at all of these parent materials, and that doesn't tell you things like what's the percent of slope that you're dealing with here? What's the drainage class of each one of these soils? If you have a drainage class where it's poorly drained or wetter, then you have saturation in the spring of the year at or near the surface. So it's not conducive to green burial. Bottom line is there's a lot of challenges. However, there are soils out there that are suitable. It's just a matter of finding them and locating them. And in some cases, it takes some pretty intensive site investigation.
We have just a couple of minutes, so just wanted to give you that heads up.
Oh, we have more time? I'm pretty much, well, what else can I tell you?
Well, we can get into it. We can definitely get into it in the question and answer. I didn't know if this was your last slide.
It is. This is the last slide. I wanted to keep it short and sweet so that I would keep it within the 10 minutes. But
great. Okay.
I guess the only other thing that I would say is that it looks daunting and challenging when you look at the characteristics that are associated with these soil types. And if you look at Web Soil Survey, there are some interpretations for animal disposal. It's a very similar situation, right? Farmers need to get rid of animal carcasses. And when you look at the soils information and you run the interpretation, often you'll see the most predominant category is severely limited, because the NRCS and the soils folks look at these limiting factors and then slap that interpretation onto it. Severe limitations because of seasonal high water table or poor filter or what have you. And it sounds very daunting when you look at that. But that said, the soil survey doesn't take the place of site investigations, and there are soils out there that are conducive to green burial. Another challenge that I just want to mention is the lack of any kind of standards for green burial. So when you're looking for suitable sites, what is the acceptable distance from the bottom of the burial to the seasonal high groundwater table? What is the acceptable permeability if you're in an area of groundwater recharge where there's a municipal well? Those kinds of things. More questions than answers in a lot of cases.
And maybe we can talk a little bit at the end about the process that we've been going through in terms of looking for a parcel that's appropriate for a conservation cemetery. So thank you very much, Al. You covered a lot.
I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, Soil Science 101. So
yeah,
thank you.
Sure.
Great. So we're so happy to have Carlos Gonzalez here, who's the operations coordinator for Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery in Gainesville, Florida. The cemetery is a nonprofit community cemetery. And Carlos is also a sitting board member for the Conservation Burial Alliance, which is a nonprofit that helps foster collaboration between conservation burial grounds, land trust partners, and the public. He holds a BFA from the Pacific Northwest College of Art and had taught previously before entering the natural burial movement. Carlos is really very keen on educating people about body disposition options, land conservation, restoration practices, and building a strong community in and out of the state of Florida. And we're just really happy to welcome you, Carlos, to Massachusetts this afternoon. And really just looking forward to your presentation.
Of course, yeah. Well, it's an honor to be here and a privilege to be speaking on behalf of what we do down here in Florida. So I'd like to thank Judith, Green Burial, Massachusetts, Kestrel Land Trust for allowing me to speak in the invitation, and also I'd like to thank Nate and Al for all the work that they do. And so it's meaningful, important work that I wish more people were involved in and that we need more of for the natural burial movement. So I'll just be focusing primarily on the technical aspect of how conservation burial works. I, unlike my fellow panel members, don't have a doctorate, so I'm not that kind of level, but I can just speak from the experiences that I have of running a natural burial ground within our community. So I just have some simple slides of some photos, and I'll just speak to them in regards to some questions that I had been given and to go over for all of you. And hopefully you all will be able to take something back with you and hopefully be inspired to help with this movement. Everyone can see my screen? Okay, so let me just view it into full screen. And everything's still good, correct? All right, so how do conservation burial grounds determine where in the actual cemetery on the grounds we will facilitate burials? Well, with everything that Nate and Al has spoken to, it's to where the utmost health is the most important thing for both the ecosystems that we work within and for our fellow man. So it took the founders for this particular cemetery a few years to find a parcel of land that was appropriate for conducting natural burial and to conduct those burial practices that were both best equitable for the environment and for people. A lot of things that natural burial does with its policies and rules and regulations mitigate the conventional burial practices and their effects that they have on the environment. And so just like everyone else, I'll quickly go through this and I'll just be scratching the surface of what that entails. So this here is just a baseline map of the actual cemetery when we were first developing plans for it. Certain trail systems, wet areas within it, that also have buffers, like in this next map that I have here, which is more of an aerial shot. And so you can see more of the topography of how we actually find particular sites for conducting burials. And so in here, you'll see areas that do have those wetlands and those buffers. That way we make sure that we stay away from those particular areas to protect that water source for plant life and for animal life. With that, the soils are also ranging in type. So there's a lot of variety within this small parcel of land. Even though it's a lot of acres, it's 93 acres within 600 acres of an actual protected preserve. We are then limited to how much of that we can then use. So with those wetland buffers and other protected areas in the cemetery, we would have roughly about 60 acres to perform burials. So that is just fine for us, given that part of conservation burial is to protect these habitats, all the while interring people's bodies into the earth. And so that is the purpose of conservation burial. And I think that's actually the most premium benefit of this form of practices, is that we have a binding agreement between our land partner and the county that this place will be forever protected, a perpetual care. That way future generations can enjoy them down the line. Now, this grid also shows the certain types of plots that we have. And part of those rules and regulations for not having a negative impact on the environment is by limiting the amount of people that we can bury per acre. And so with that, a lot of our sites are a lot larger in comparison to conventional burials. That way we don't have a negative impact on the soil system, the plant life, and just life in general. So this here is just an example of how large a site can be. Whenever we come out, we check to see exactly what's growing there, given that we don't want to harm anything that is well established, whether it be a particular type of ground cover, wildflower, native Indian grass, or tree. We have specific rules and regulations to follow. That way we work around that. So based off the particular size of our plots that we work with, we have some flexibility of where we can place a grave within that size of that plot. So grave sizes are typically 7 feet by 3 feet. These sites are 10 feet by 15 feet. So that allows us to do what we need to do to protect the soils and the plant life that is there that supports insects, wildlife, and humans. So some more shots of how the geology ranges within the cemetery. This is more clay-based. These are more tougher to dig. So for those who are intending to help, it is quite a bit of effort. It's also here to where we have those rocks that we don't wish to encounter, but that we occasionally do. And then more focused on sand-based graves, which is more common in the cemetery, given that we are in an area considered to be central lowlands in this particular place of Florida. And so it's more permeable sands, silts, clay sands, sandy clays, and sometimes even perfect loamy areas that has that great combination of sand, clay, and silt. So having those three is having that perfect combination for allowing things to decompose appropriately within a habitat. It's also to where we're on a confining layer that's above the aquifer system. So we do have varying water tables within the cemetery so that it runs off and it doesn't impact any potable water that is ever used by the public. So this is just a shot of us working in one of those sandy graves. As for basic tools and supplies that you would need to work in this type of soil, it's utmost for the safety of the people who are working and eventually for the people who will be attending a burial. given that sand-based graves, there's more of a tendency for them to collapse given the distribution of weight around the actual site. So here we have digging frames that we use. That way we don't impact the land just right around it. And then we have separate tarps, one that will carry the topsoil. That way, when we complete the burial, that will go right back on top. And that's the most nutrient-rich soil that will then support the plant growth and to reestablish things as they need to come back naturally. The other tarp that you'll see in this photo, that larger black one, that's for the sublayers, the other ones that will eventually be put back the way they came out. So we kind of work in reverse. That way everything goes back the way it came out. And so that's the method that we have developed. And it's shown to be beneficial to the environment. So what's quite interesting to me is whenever we have buried someone close to a large specimen, you can actually see like physical repercussions from that. Like a tree would have brighter, deeper, greener leaves, which is just fascinating to me of how just by placing a body into the earth, it's nutrient loading an area that may not have that form of life in it. So our bodies are made up of all these important things that the earth need in order to provide a healthy environment. So it's quite interesting just to see that within the time that I've been working at the cemetery. So here we actually have one of our volunteer grave diggers in the actual grave. And so it can be done as long as people learn appropriately on how to do it. Usually we have at least 2 people there for safety measures. That way, just in case if something were to happen, they'd be able to help them if something did happen. Fortunately for us, we haven't run into any issues in working in sand-based in graves. And so you kind of want to work backwards, kind of like a relief sculpture. That way you don't have that collapse that tends to happen within sand-based graves. So we highly recommend finding a mentor. I've been lucky and fortunate to have founders still around to help me learn the process. That way I can teach others in my community and beyond to how to properly dig graves in sand-based areas. So this here is another shot closer into the actual grave of just those different layers of soil.
Carlos, I think there's a little bit of a delay maybe in the slides.
Okay.
We're still seeing the person with the in the grave. Okay, so now we've got.
Go back there. Can you see it now?
We can see the
Okay.
the lines in the different kinds of soil.
Yeah, the close-up. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so we dig down to about 42 inches, which is 3.5 feet. That way oxygen can reach the body to help with the decomposition process and also heat to radiate down to help that process engage. So bodies based off of education materials that I've come across shown to that bodies soft tissue goes away within the first few months. And then eventually over time, depending on the soil type that a body is placed within, it'll completely go back to the earth, including the bone. And so that can take from a minimum of like 8 years to 20 years, depending on the soil type. And so there's definitely more need of the science to back our practices. And again, here's another shot of the separation of those types of soil as we are working. So the one on the bottom is the topsoil, and the other is what has then come out from underneath that. So the stuff that's on top of that pile will be what was at the very bottom of the grave, and the stuff at the bottom of that pile is the stuff that was closer to the top, to the surface.
Just have a few minutes left, Carlos.
Yeah, sure, thank you.
Yeah.
So as for making sure that family and friends who do attend services don't harm the integrity of the actual grave, founders and volunteers had developed this ceremonial frame to reestablish and to move the weight distribution away from the actual grave itself. That way, we wouldn't harm the actual site from just our interaction of going through a ceremony. And so if you look closer into the actual rectangle of the grave, we have these little slots here where pieces of wood can actually go in and hold the soil back. just in case as an extra protective layer, but we never had to use that in the past 11 years that we've been doing burials this way. And that was just an extra safety precaution to hold the earth back just in case if something were to happen. But if people learn the proper techniques of digging a grave by hand, then most likely they won't run into those issues. The only other issue when it comes to working in sand-based soils is to where it can sometimes retain moisture a lot longer than other zones within a particular area and different soil types. So if we know that we've had some rain the previous night, or if there was a storm, we go out and we post-hole dig certain places within areas that we know it'll retain more moisture. That way, if we were to dig, we would avoid having an overrun, an inundated grave with water, which with sand, it'll just make it collapse immediately as you're digging. So there would be no way to dig a grave in this type in that fashion. And so luckily for us, we have different active burial zones within the cemetery. That way people can choose from them and we can inform them of how we cannot use a particular area. And as long as people are transparent, open, and honest about these practices, then people are very understanding and then select a site if they wish to be close as possible to a particular area that they like that is around this sandy area, or they choose an area in a completely different spot in the cemetery. So that's just something to be aware of. And for each slide and every topic I'm going over, there's a lot more behind it. So this is just a little bit of that there. This here is just an example of staff, volunteers, and family facilitating a burial, and you can see how many people would be around that grave. And so if we didn't have that actual frame there, it would really impact the structure and integrity of the sides and walls of the grave. So here's another there. But it just goes to show that it is achievable. You can do such burials within these soil types, and it shouldn't restrict people from not doing it. So the last couple minutes, I'll just go over how community gets involved and what it means to people that are close and dear to us, that are close in proximity, but also from far away, and building that rich community and togetherness. So fortunately for us, we have an amazing community of volunteers that want to help people and families in need, but also be a part of conservation, burial, and land management practices, and protecting this particular area for a multitude of purposes. Cemeteries in the past were used as meeting grounds for people to come together and to converse, to talk and discuss topics, whether it was politics, art, music, and just to get together. And so we see that a lot within our own cemetery. So how that works as for coordinating with volunteers, that's part of my position and role, but we actually have a founding board member and founding member of the cemetery that was very connected within the community and has built a following. And so that group is actually called the Society of the Pick and Spade. And so whenever we do need help to dig a grave, we make a post online and people can sign up. And so those people have either had previous experience with burying a loved one within our cemetery, find it meaningful to be of service to others, or had just learned about us and just want to come out and just learn about what we do. I think a big aspect of how we can continue to further educate people is by having mentorships in some regard, and that's something that I wish could grow in this field of death care. Yeah, I can go into more of that later on, but then that actually goes into actually having family and friends participate as well. So for our cemetery, we have a unique culture and education-based formula to allow families and friends to participate. It's very meaningful for people to actually be physically involved with actually preparing the site for their loved one. It helps them move forward during that bereavement period. People are going through a range of emotions, and actually being out in nature and helping take care of their own loved one that has died, it's proven to be beneficial to their mental well-being. And so people always afterwards, if they help us, they always reach out again to say, hey, what can I do? This was such an eye-opening experience, so unique and so special. And I want other people to enjoy this experience as well. And after they complete it, they go, this makes complete sense. You know, this is the way it was originally done in the past. This is the traditional form of burial. It's just to where nowadays the funeral industry has become a beast of its own and does not want to have this form of competition of just having the original form of burial of what was done before the Industrial Revolution. But yeah, there's so much there, so much unpacking. I can go more in depth about everything, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the questions are, but yeah, just a little bit. So yeah.
Yes, so thank you, Carl. I mean, again, and you have, all three of you have done such a great job at getting through a lot of information in a short time, and we really appreciate that. We did want to spend some time going through our questions and just having a discussion. So I'm wondering, Candace, if you can, you've been monitoring the questions. Do you have questions for our panelists?
Yes, I would like to start with Al. So someone said, so the focus for green burial seems to be for aerobic decomposition. Is there any consideration for anaerobic burial where carbon can be sequestered after burial? Do you have thoughts on anaerobic versus aerobic, Al?
I would say the conventional wisdom is to keep the body out of the seasonal, out of the water table.
And
if there's some negative to anaerobic decomposition, it obviously is slower. You know, you're putting a nutrient load directly into the water table. But yeah, in the few examples that I have seen of any kind of standards that deal with animal burial, one of them is always maintaining a distance between the bottom of the burial and the water table.
thank you. It reminds me, I attended a dinner party before COVID, and there was a woman there who had her hair all dressed up in a fancy swirl. And she said she mimicked a bog woman. This woman had just been dug up who was in a bog, and her hairstyle was still intact.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be an indication that we don't decompose in boggy areas. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any resources available to municipalities looking to determine if there are suitable green burial locations in their town? And a corollary to that is, how is our search for land for a natural burial ground different than if we're looking for land for a traditional or a conventional cemetery? Would anybody like to take that?
I guess I can probably try to respond to the first question with regard to resources available. There is the
Great.
soil survey that is going to give an indication of what soil properties should tend to exist in a particular area. The last I looked, there was not a specific interpretation for green burial. I have suggested it, though. I think that my former agency should develop one. That said, those interpretations tend to be pretty conservative, so that if it's not a perfect scenario, it's going to red flag as being limited. But the soil survey information can be used as an inference as to what the suitabilities are for green burial. And Candace and I have experience with that. It's limited, but it helps you target.
Thank you, Al.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, there are no differences for natural versus the conventional cemetery in the eyes of the Department of Public Health and the Environmental Protection. A cemetery is a cemetery is a cemetery. So there's no difference. And for Nate, who is doing research regarding environmental and public health impacts of traditional burial, and how can we support?
Internationally, it's happening, but here in North America, let alone the U.S., it's not. I have talked to Judith a little bit and said, "Hey, we can do it." So, it's an avenue that I'm interested in doing. And in terms of supporting, I mean, if there is a demand that's available from the public, then push us and we can do it. But that's a conversation I like to have with Al, Judith, and Carlos, and see if we can push that in Massachusetts to actually develop the resources that Al's talking about and see their merits, because based on my own observations, they're there. We just haven't been able to publish it from an academic standpoint.
Thank you. I've just posted a web link to the web soil survey that Al mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. If you Google web soil survey, it'll be the first thing that comes up.
And related to some of the resources available to municipalities, what we found while searching for land is working with Al. He was able to help us identify categories of soils that might be suitable, but always needed further investigation. This was a huge step for us to be able to narrow certain parcels and properties to find out, is this a possible site? But this was something that Greenbow, Massachusetts, with Al, with Kestrel Land Trust, we've done this together as a team. So there have been little surveys, little support from the state in trying to get this done. We really needed the brain power of Al to help us.
So Candace, we just have a minute or so left. I'm wondering if there's any last question that hasn't been answered.
Yes, here's one more. It might increase costs, but is it possible to consider lower quality soil sites if fill is brought in to raise the soil surface close to the grave?
I would say, yeah.
yeah.
I would say sure. I don't see, as long as the material is suitable, why not?
Well, yeah, I guess it would have to depend on the specific rules and regulations for that particular conservation burial ground. One of the basic principles is to not alter the land that you're working within already. You're just there to protect that land and conduct some land restoration if you can in some aspect without really having too big of an impact. And so I know for us, we just do work within the cemetery. We don't bring outside material other than maybe native species of plants that we would like to reintroduce into the land to create more biodiversity. But as for bringing soils into the land from other places, we haven't considered that. I don't think we'll do that, given it'll alter the landscape. And the land is so dynamic, it's going to change over time too. And with climate change, it'll have an effect on the soil types at some regard. So we're doing what we can with this time that we have. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. Judith, there's one more question here that maybe you can close up the process with, about sharing about our current process.
Yes.
Our current search.
Yes, well, the good news is that we have a promising parcel in the West Hampton, Northampton area, and it meets many of our criteria for views, access, conservation values. And right now we're really working through the green burial permitting process. And so we will let you know if and when the cemetery is officially approved. And then when we let you know, you're just going to keep hearing from us. And so you'll So please stay tuned. We will, obviously we'll get out to our email list and other areas, but we feel very optimistic, even more so than we were back in February when we did our last webinar, our big webinar back then. So yes, definitely stay tuned. We believe that good news is coming. And so I want to thank all of our panelists, really just so delighted to have you here and sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it very much, Carlos, Al, and Nate. And I want to just also thank all of you for continuing to stay with us through our search and to attend our various presentations and to go to our website and to support us financially and in many, many ways. So thanks again. We will have this recording on the VCC website, so we'll put that up in the next couple of days. Thanks for your interest in Green Burial, Massachusetts. Thanks for the interest in the GBM Kestrel VCC project. And thanks for your interest in soil. Have a good one, everyone.
Nice job, Judith, Candace. Thank you so much for putting this together.
Thank you.